The Florida State Seminoles have as much preseason hype and expectations as they've had maybe in the last 7 years or so. The Seminoles had an impressive season in 2022, tallying up 10 wins, but some folks think that 2023 will be even better. It's August 19th on the day of recording this, and the 2023 season opener against LSU is just 2 weeks away. That's right, Noles fans, and really fans of college football in general. In 2 weeks, the 2023 season will be in full swing. It's been a long offseason, and we've all been anxiously waiting to see what the Noles can go out and do this year, so let's dive into the schedule. Of course, all eyes are on the season opener against LSU, and we're going to focus a little extra on this one because, frankly, I think it's the most important game of the entire season. This will be a Sunday night game that will likely have every fan in the country tuned in. FSU also opened up last season against LSU, but this time the game will be played at Camping World Stadium here in Orlando. It's technically a neutral site game, but of course I fully expect the FSU fan base takeover here. Florida State beat LSU last year in dramatic fashion with a last-second block field goal to win the game by 1 point. As awesome as it was to close that one out, the last few minutes of that game don't necessarily tell the whole story. You guys may remember FSU was in control for pretty much the entire game. Had it not been for a few crucial mistakes super late in the game, maybe most notably a fumble pitch on the 1 yard line, that should have been a go-ahead touchdown to go up by multiple scores and put the game away. This led to LSU making it incredibly nerve-wracking in the final minute and almost coming back to tie it up. I think the way the game ended and the final score of FSU only winning by 1 point kind of put a bad taste in a lot of our mouths. We know it shouldn't have really been that close, but the fact is, it was. It also led to a lot of critics essentially trying to say that FSU won off of a fluke, but I disagree. I think LSU was only able to keep it that close off of a few flukes. LSU had their mishaps as well, including a few muffed punts, but the Tiger defense really had no stop for Jordan Travis and the Seminole offense. Now on to this year, because I do expect this game to be similar to the last one. I don't expect as many mishaps or turnovers by either team, but I do expect a battle. FSU leads the nation in return to production and absolutely cleaned up in the transfer portal, adding guys like Fentrell Cypress, Jaheim Bell, Keon Coleman, and more. Now, LSU always recruits well, and they also brought in an impressive group of transfers. Now, a few of the transfers that LSU brought in were in their secondary, which took a hit when they announced that probably their biggest addition, Denver Harris, was no longer with the team. This is a hit to a secondary that was likely already outmatched to begin with. This receiver core for FSU is dangerous, and frankly, I just don't know how you guard against it. You have massive Johnny Wilson, who's 6'7". You have Keon Coleman, who's 6'4", and a one-on-one 50-50 ball nightmare. You have tight end Kyle Morlock, who's also 6'7", and you brought in Jaheim Bell from South Carolina, who's 6'3" and can pretty much play any position on the field. They line him up at running back, tight end, receiver, all kinds of stuff. This is all not to mention Jordan Travis, Trey Benson, and the running game, all behind what should be an even better offensive line. I expect LSU to have a very solid defensive line, but I just don't see how their secondary holds up to all the different looks and weapons that FSU can present. I think that's the difference maker in this game, and it's why I have the Noles taking care of business and getting another Week 1 dub against LSU, though it may be close. Now, Week 2 against the Southern Miss Golden Eagles. This will be back in Doak for an 8:30 kickoff. I will actually be attending this game. Tickets weren't that expensive, and night games in Doak are an amazing atmosphere, especially with FSU being ranked in the top 10 coming off a hopeful win against LSU. You know, I don't really know what all to say about this game. I certainly don't want to overlook any opponent, but this should be a win. They have Frank Gore Jr., who's a decent running back, but I just don't think it'll be enough for them to really hang with the Seminoles here. FSU should take care of business and win convincingly. If Jordan Travis isn't in a ball cap by the third quarter, something's went wrong. So this should be a chance for the second teams to get some reps as well. Week 2 is a win. Week 3, the Seminoles go to Boston College for a noon kickoff against the Eagles. So in September, FSU plays 2 Eagles teams and 2 Tigers teams. This game wasn't close last year. FSU dismantled them, winning 44-14. Granted, this game was at home for FSU, but I don't really expect that to matter much. FSU is far and away the more talented team here. I hate noon kickoffs, and FSU has been known to play a bit sloppy during these kind of games, but FSU should be able to afford to play a B- game and still win pretty comfortably. So 3-0 headed to Clemson. This is a big one, especially if you truly are 3-0 at this point. I expect College Game Day to be there, and this is why I think the LSU game and beating LSU are so important, because FSU should be playing fairly loose here, knowing that the worst case, even with a loss, you'll probably see Clemson again in the ACC Championship game, and with a win there, even with one loss, you could probably still make the playoffs if it all works out. This game is at Clemson, so I don't love being on the road for in-conference opponents 2 weeks in a row, and we all know how well Clemson plays at home. I expect Clemson to be decent this year as well. They hired a new offensive coordinator, and Cade Klubnik is definitely a player, but he's young, and trying to learn a new offensive system could potentially cause a few growing pains here and there. They have a week one matchup against Duke that I think could be tougher than most think, but I still do expect Clemson to win there. But if FSU is healthy, they could go in there with this defensive line of Fabian Lovett, Braden Fisk, Joshua Farmer, and of course Jared Verse, etc. I think they really could take advantage of a young quarterback and force some errors and negative plays. This game is truly a tell-all for what FSU can and will be in 2023. This is probably the hardest game to predict on the season because there's just so many factors going into it. I think it'll definitely be a close game, and I could really see it going either way. If FSU is healthy and plays to their potential, they could absolutely win this game. Now, if FSU has too many mental errors and shoots themselves in the foot like they've been known to do, it could be more of the same from the last several years against Clemson. This is a hump that FSU fans need to see Mike Norvell and this team get over. This is the kind of thing you gotta do to win championships. I'm gonna push all my chips in the middle here and say that FSU wins a close, hard-fought game and finally beats Clemson and takes back control of the conference, all right before we get ready to leave it. Now, thankfully, after what will be a very exciting but tough September, and fingers crossed, undefeated September, FSU gets a bye week that's probably going to be much needed to catch their breath and rest up for the rest of the season. Some people don't like the bye week being this early, but I think it's pretty well placed after being on the road for 2 weeks, having two top 12 matchups in the opening month of the season. I think you'll need this bye week here. Now, back in Doak for week 5, what should be a top 4 ranked FSU team takes on Virginia Tech. You guys may remember the nightmare that was the last time we played them, and it was absolutely brutal and just the beginning of an awful Willie Taggart era. Not this time, though. Florida State handles Va Tech in front of a packed Doak Campbell Stadium and a whole slew of recruits and gets to 5-0. Now, week 6, Syracuse coming to town. Just like the Boston College game last year, the Syracuse game wasn't close either. I only expect it to be worse for the Orange this time around. Week 6 is a dub. Now, on to what could be a fairly interesting matchup against Duke. If you remember, we mentioned a few minutes ago that they played Clemson to start the season as well. I'm not predicting them to upset Clemson, but what if they do? Or what if they lose to Clemson, but it's a tight, competitive kind of game? Is Duke for real, or is everybody overhyping an 8-win season? Which, don't get me wrong, 8 wins is good for Duke, and I do like their quarterback, Riley Leonard, but I just don't think they have enough to beat what should be a FSU team on a mission to make the playoffs at this point. Florida State wins this one. Week 8, FSU heads to Wake Forest. Now, I hate Wake Forest. They're just one of those teams that's just kind of been a thorn in FSU's side for a while now. FSU hasn't beaten Wake since 2018, and Wake Forest also handed Florida State its first loss last season, which was incredibly irritating, especially because I was at that game as well. Now, Wake Forest lost their quarterback, Sam Hartman, which I think was essentially the focal point of that offense. They still have decent wide receivers, and they run that really gadgety, slow mess type of offense that's really frustrating to watch, and I know it's got to be frustrating to game plan for and defend on the field. But it's time Wake Forest relearns its place in this conference, and I think with them losing their quarterback especially, Florida State wins this one as well. Week 9 against Pitt. Now, on the surface, this game doesn't really tell the whole story. I don't like this game. It has trap game written all over it, in my opinion. Pitt is no slouch. They even won the conference in 2021. Granted, that was with Jordan Addison and an NFL talent at quarterback, but still. Pat Narduzzi seems to be good for at least one upset a year, which I don't like that either. This game is also at Pitt in November, which I think makes this game a much bigger story. Florida boys aren't used to that kind of cold. Novembers in Florida are still in the 80s most of the time. I think FSU will have to prepare well for this game, but I think they will. I think Mike Norvell conditions his team well for travel and things like this. The only other aspect is that FSU plays Miami the very next week. This could cause some potential look ahead, and when you combine that with the cold, on-the-road conference opponent, it could spell issue for the Seminoles. On paper, FSU absolutely wins this game. They just got to make sure they stay focused and prep well. It might be a sloppy game, especially depending on the weather conditions, but I have the Noles still winning here. Now on to what is probably going to be the biggest recruiting weekend in season for FSU, the Miami Hurricanes coming back to Doak for what I think will be another beatdown. I hate Miami. I don't like a lot of their fans. And they might be some kind of off-season champs, but they're just not at FSU's level right now. They had a very, very poor 2022 season, and though I do expect them to be slightly improved, I still don't see them being a very good team this year. I also don't think Mario Cristobal is that good of a coach at all. I think people put way too much stock into him beating Ohio State back at Oregon, which, don't get me wrong, was a good win. but he's 67-67 all time as the head coach. I'm just not buying into the hype, and I'm not seeing the Hurricanes being good anytime soon, to be honest with you. Florida State wins, and Miami better hope it's not too much worse than the 45-3 smackdown they got last year. North Alabama coming to Doak. Again, I really don't know much about this team, but FSU's backup should be able to handle this game. It's a win. So now 11-0, probably a top 3 ranked FSU team, depending on what other teams like UGA, Bama, and all of those kind of teams do, and how impressive Florida State has looked up until this point. Florida State travels to the Swamp to play the Gators to end the regular season. Florida went 6-7 last year with an embarrassing blowout loss in their bowl game against Oregon State. That was with the best offensive line in the SEC and a top 5 draft pick at quarterback in Anthony Richardson. That's all gone now, and they didn't recruit a quarterback in the 2023 cycle, and they even had a backup player, Jalen Kitna, get arrested and is now off the team. This essentially leaves them down to just Graham Mertz at quarterback, who is probably mid at best, behind a less talented offensive line. Florida has talent. They have a few good receivers, and their defensive line seems to be decent, but I've heard some stuff from their practices that don't sound too promising for them, especially at the quarterback and offensive line positions. I know it's a rivalry game. I know it was even a tight one last year. It was tighter than it should have been. This one's in the Swamp, which isn't ideal, but I do expect Florida to struggle all season, but especially against a talented and well-balanced Florida State team. This is another one that could be kind of ugly at times for FSU, especially depending on if Florida is able to work out some of their kinks by the end of the season, but I have Florida State winning this one as well. Now, I know it sounds crazy predicting FSU to go 12-0, and that pretty much guarantees a spot in the playoff and likely guarantees that Jordan Travis is at least invited to New York for the Heisman ceremony, if he's just not the outright winner. Hearing it all out loud makes you feel kind of crazy, but I think that might just be PTSD of the last several years. This schedule really isn't that tough, especially outside of September, so if you can find some success early, there's absolutely no reason you can't just run the table. This team returns a ton of production, has added even more via recruiting in the transfer portal, and all the guys have had yet another year to build the chemistry. The offensive line should be improved, so should the defensive line and the DBs with Pastor Tambian added to the staff. This is already one of the most explosive offenses in the country last year, and with even more weapons added, it should be better. I'm, of course, a bit biased, but I'm buying into the Florida State hype. I think this team has a ton of potential, and if they live up to it, they could absolutely be a playoff team in 2023. We'll, of course, have to see how the season goes, how it all plays out. Hopefully the team can stay relatively healthy, play well, and make it an electric 2023 season. I'll definitely be losing my voice every Saturday from here until January. But let me know what you guys think. What do you predict Noles' record will be by season's end? Let me know in the comments, and let's talk Noles.